You may have noticed that what I've tried to do all along has been to smuggle into anthropological circles someone who barely qualifies as a literary figure from outside of the academy to show that certain conversations of a serious nature are possible, and that we could, if we really wanted to take our academy forward, our academic activities, find conversation partners both within the academy from other disciplines, but also, and more importantly, from outside of the academy, to have productive conversations on knowledge and how it is produced and consumed. And the last lecture goes further to use two of Amos Tutuola's books. The one, My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, and the second, The Wild Hunter in the Bush of Ghosts, to explore the notion of citizenship from the vantage point of incompleteness in motion. I urge Susan to pre-circulate the written paper with the idea that you could flip through and have a sense of the sort of things that I use to instantiate this argument. So I would just share with you the introductory comments, and then we can have some concluding thoughts and hopefully have a more exciting and prolonged discussion. So I argue that citizenship is expected to mitigate the challenges of having to function as if one were living in splendid isolation. Whether we label it an all-englobing term or use different instantiations of citizenship, the aspiration of citizenship is to be supported and to feel supported by the cultural, political, and economic communities with which human beings in their incompleteness and mobility identify through relationships, shared memories, commitments, and responsibilities. Citizenship is more about a community of belonging that gives us visibility, with whom our loyalties lie, and that comes to our aid when we are in difficulties. The articulation of citizenship is more productive through an exploration of its indicators and instantiations than by the formality of it being conferred administratively. Citizenship has meaning to us in our incompleteness through the technologies or juju if it affords us to activate or extend ourselves. And one way in which I try to understand citizenship is to compare it to the conventions whereby airlines reward loyalty and regularity through frequent flyer programs. Airlines operate in a world of unstable hierarchies of visibility. The only stable indicators of visibility are the class in which one flies and the extent to which one is able to maintain one's place in that class. If one cannot afford a first-class ticket or to pay for a flight, one falls short of inclusion and therefore can only belong in principle when flying is discussed as something that is open to everyone without discrimination. Those who can afford to fly economy belong to the rudiments of the flying community and are often initiated into frequent flyer initiatives such as ivory, blue membership, and status, and challenged to prove themselves by climbing up the frequent flyer hierarchy. Alliances such as Sky Team, Star Alliance, and One World that enable one to earn and spend sky miles and privilege across a range of airlines are an added incentive. To climb is one thing. The challenge is how to maintain and improve one's status. Those who fail to find themselves find themselves slipping back down the rankings from platinum to ivory or blue through gold and silver. Those who have been frequent flyers, silver, gold, and platinum, and then lost it, suddenly realize that the privileges or status symbols they used to enjoy are evaporating into thin air. Their priority check-ins and boardings, fast-track lanes, and access to the lounges are withdrawn, and they are made to feel like the scum of the flying earth. So, like the potential for frequent flyer visibility and privileges, citizenship is something that is available to all and sundry in principle, but that seems elusive even for those who have earned it. The blatant dynamic between citizenship and class is evidence. Those who can afford it. Thank you. The rankings of different tickets displays how even sometimes as small as an airline can, the rankings of different tickets displays how even something as small as an airline can act as an independent community, a sovereign one almost. In an airport, even when one feels as though one is being discriminated against, one is more likely to give up all of one's civic liberties just so one does not jeopardize one's getting on that plane. It seems one cannot or no longer rest on one's laurels as a citizen. One may be born into a context where one feels one belongs, and suddenly that belonging is threatened, perhaps because one has embraced a cause or an ideology that is frowned upon for one reason or another by people with power to dictate beliefs and practices and to police belonging within a given polity. For example, one joins a group labeled as fundamentalist that takes one to a place like Syria, for example, or Afghanistan, and then one loses one's British citizenship or American citizenship, and that thought, what one thought one had from birth until death suddenly evaporates like the frequent flyer status of someone who has fallen through the ranks. One flies to Pakistan, Iran, Somalia, and then one is blackmailed or blacklisted in some countries. One has to prove that one was in that country not for terrorist business. Those who are frequently subjected to searches based on where their passports indicate they have been or are from are bound to think of certain airports as zones of harassment. Such airports must feel like foreign soil to them, maybe even an alien planet, and as inside their citizenship no longer matters. They are forever marked by an algorithm in a system on the hunt for terrorists. In this sense, the concept of citizenship and belonging only in principle becomes vacuous. It renders citizenship desultory, only in conditional, ephemeral, unpredictable, and hypocritical. It is not morally just when the underclass potentially deserving of rights to belong, like everyone else, cannot enjoy full citizenship rights because of identity markers such as economic status, sexuality, sexual orientation, or religion. What we are habituated to think as was citizenship for all turns out in practice to be a facade that continues to shift to suit the changing demands of those in power and privilege. Now, what has Amos Tutuola got to share with us on how to think about citizenship? First, one can ill afford to take the idea of citizenship for granted. Hence, my subscription to and advocacy for adopting a framework of incompleteness for appreciating citizenship as a permanent work in progress. Tutuola's writings help us understand the making, unmaking, and remaking of citizenship, a perspective that is best seen in historical process and through the prism of incompleteness in motion. Although I credit Tutuola with inspiring an incompleteness framework for citizenship, it is worth bearing in mind his struggles for citizenship as an African writer who was presumptuously classified as having failed to master the English language as a technology or a juju of citizenship in colonial Nigeria. In a context in which English was a language of visibility, prestige, and power, Tutuola, the writer, was not considered citizen enough in a modern colonial sense to tell a story. In the colonial register, he was a man of modest education who lacked the structure or the stature of the sort of creative imagination associated with the truly schooled and cultivated. Indeed, the contents of his tales and the universe he depicts in his writings remind us of the dangers of a citizenship predicated upon hierarchies that are driven by a logic of belonging by exclusion. The contents and the context of his tales were about an Africa that colonizers were appealing to everyone to supersede or to go beyond. It was an Africa that colonizers represented as lacking the Eurocentric qualities of citizenship, such as European modernity, and therefore deserving of heavy-duty investment in civilizing, in what became known as the civilizing mission in Africa amongst Africans. But paradoxically, it was also an African variant of representations of which the colonizer did not quite want to give up on. The imagery of a dark continent reluctant to embrace European modernity and its Enlightenment pretensions was not easy to give up on beyond the appearance of doing so. Hence, Tutuola was both hated and loved. Thus, purely for the rhetoric of it, anything that stood in the way of the contrived colonial citizenship belonged to the realm of backward traditions and the superstitious primitivity. Tutuola and his writings thus constituted the savage noises of barbarism at the primitive margins of the empire of modernity and its bandwagon of indicators of citizenship. Civilization as a justification for colonialism was to invite Africans to deny what they had grown up in terms of cultural values and indicators of belonging, and to embrace something new, whether real or imagined. To ordinary Africans whose universe he depicted in his writings, Tutuola was not perceived as jeopardizing the fast-tracking of African graduation into modern colonial citizenship. Those who held him in contempt were Africans seeking visibility within the colonial modernity. To the African colonial elite, those who had subscribed to colonial modernity and its zero-sum expectations of citizenship, through an obsessive fixation with distinctions between townsmen and tribesmen, citizens and subjects, natives and settlers, Tutuola was not the sort of person to be writing in a context of the alternate and increasingly dominant model of being and belonging which colonialism expounded. He lacked mastery of and depth in the language of civilization and its variants of citizenship. Especially for those who had embraced colonialism's one-dimensional ideas and linear template of citizenship, he was telling stories that stood supposedly forward-looking Africans who were like potted plants in the greenhouses of European modernity, backwards rather than forward. It is hardly surprising, therefore, that his most furious critics came from within his own circles, among Africans who were journeying abroad to European bushes of ghosts, treasure hunting for modern citizenship in colonial seats of wisdom, such as London, Oxford, and Cambridge. For the crystallizing colonial elite intellectuals of Nigeria, his country of birth, ethnic and colonial citizenship were particularly virulent. It was almost as if to say, in frequent flyer speak, we are making a lot of mileage to belong to this new currency of citizenship. And you, Amos Tutuola, dare to pull us back? Indeed, the zero-sum logic of colonial citizenship, and by extension, many a regime of citizenship predicated upon exclusionary indicators of belonging and living togetherness, must be factored in to appreciate both the predicaments of Tutuola and his Nigerian and African critics. It is quite sad that it's quite sad to think how people Tutuola should call his own are the very ones denying him of the very citizenship that could be revoked from them as well, granted the ever-diminishing circles of inclusion upon which such a logic of citizenship is founded. The tentative or conditional inclusion of which they are so protective could be revoked at any time, revoked by those Tutuola directly revoked by those Tutuola is directly defined and those his Nigerian critics wish to impress. For, as Killam observes, despite the efforts of the educated African to impress his or her white benefactors, colonial English fiction tended to depict them always unfavorably compared with uneducated tribesmen, or pompous, arrogant, or bearing and affected in manners and speech, and as grotesquely imitating the attitudes of the white man, as he says. The paradox is of a colonial modernity inviting Africans to aspire only to be rejected and confined to the very same purportedly primitive traditions that colonialism's civilizing mission was supposed to free them. Writers of colonial English fiction were reluctant to entertain the prospect of a crystallizing African elite seeking prerogatives and responsibilities away from African customs and traditions. Perhaps that is what the colonizers wanted all along, for the colonized, through the games and hierarchies of inclusion, to turn against each other rather than see who the true enemy is: racialized, institutionalized delusions of completeness. The idea of incompleteness in Tutuola that I find very useful is discussed in opposition to the colonial quest for completeness through horrendous violence and violations. An example which I have explored is that of Cecil Rhodes, whom I describe as the complete gentleman of imperial dominance. In an article, I compare Rhodes and his ambitions of completeness through ruthless colonial and imperial accumulation and dehumanization with Tutuola's humility and the courage of incompleteness and the possibilities of conviviality that it generates. It is, for example, thanks to Cecil Rhodes' idea of being complete and his ambitions of Cape to Cairo, that Southern Africa was systematically plundered and dehumanized through the tragedies of colonialism and apartheid. Tragedies that insisted and fed on racialized and ethnicized distinctions between citizens and subjects, settlers and native. Unlike Rhodes, who sought to have the glaring evidence of his incompleteness with delusional pursuit, to hide the glaring evidence of his incompleteness with delusional pursuits of supremacy through vacuous claims of completeness, Tutuola is the eternally incomplete gentleman who writes in a very grounded sense in terms of pointing to life as an eternal incompleteness. For Tutuola, incompleteness is not a condition to shy away from or be guilty of or feel that you need to work hard to complete it, but rather just something to recognize and embrace. The travails of or inconveniences of incompleteness can be mitigated through various technologies of activation and self-extension, which in the last lecture you heard a lot about when I compared the ICTs to Juju. Similarly, if we embrace a much more incomplete idea of citizenship, then even how we embrace digital and related technologies to enhance prevalent indicators of citizenship becomes shaped differently. For instance, terms such as digital nomad visa and digital citizenship would become normalized. Technologies, just as they prop us up, they can also deflate us without warning. Technologies are as much forces of liberation as they are tools of repression and suppression. Just as we can use them to enhance a meaningful citizenship in our lives, the very same technologies can be adopted and adapted by states, governments, and economic and cultural elites, among others, to police freedoms and limit inclusion. Thus, the positive role of digital technologies must not be taken for granted. Inspired by Tutuola, we are more likely to articulate citizenship not as a zero-sum technology of self-extension. Rather, it becomes just one technology amongst many others for enhancing ourselves through the circulation of life as an unending process of encounters, death, and indebtedness. And if you want to see the examples that I give from the Bush of Ghosts and from the two novels selected, they are from page 4 of the pre-circulated paper to page 16. Some concluding thoughts. Those who straddle the sort of identity margins that we notice in the bush, in the bush of ghosts, such as the halfies or split selves, half and halves, betwixt and between, half human, half animal, half plant, half god, half ghost, and so on and so forth. Those who straddle such identity margins are like interpreters, translators, diviners, and kindred frontier beings. They represent a world where absolutes are de-emphasized in the interest of being and becoming as permanent work in progress. Embracing incompleteness and mobility as permanencies would enable us to champion a world of half and halves, as represented by the earthly person and the wild hunter in the bush of ghost, especially through their attempts at adapting and integrating in terms of learning the language, getting married, having a hybrid son who is half ghostess and half earthly, born and die babies, burglar ghosts, etc., caught betwixt and between, while still yearning to reconnect somehow with their earthly communities with facilitations from all sorts of technologies, which in the bush of ghost is the television-handed ghostess and lots of other technologies. So if you embrace the idea of incompleteness, then having a situation where one is betwixt and between becomes the norm and not an exception. To invest in the absolutism of completeness and to proceed in zero-sum fashion that enables us to see and relate to citizenship and belonging only in terms of, to draw on Victor Turner, what we expect to see and have been conditioned to see when we have learned the definitions and classifications of our cultures, is to continue to treat as structurally and socially invisible or not yet classified those, albeit physically visible, we detect as being outside of the predictable or established geographies of confinement and containment. Far from treating their worlds, its ambiguities and paradoxes as neither this nor that, transitional, liminal, polluting, and confusing, because unclear and unclean. The half and halves that we meet in Tutuola's world and in many diasporic situation are a realm of pure possibility whence novel configurations of ideas and relations may arise. It is a frontier world of composites marked by, as Turner puts it, processes of growth, transformation, and the reformulation of old elements in new patterns. To be an outsider within or an insider without is to tickle the imagination and encourage conversations between the possible and the impossible on the humility and courage of incompleteness that such betwixt and between categories represent. The world of outsiders within and insiders without is not a world of clean and clear dichotomies, but rather a betwixt and between world of impurities generated to strengthen incompleteness in motion. As such, those who owned up to the half and half or compositeness and frontier existence are an inspiration to others unduly defined and confined by custom and law to the detriment of the freedom to embrace and harness incompleteness through flexible mobility and flexible citizenship. As a storehouse of possibilities, to quote Turner again, today's liminality is tomorrow's centrality, inviting us to appreciate the creative effervescence of borders instead of being silenced by them. This is especially the case in societies characterized by high rates of mobility, as was the case with Ndembo, who fascinated Turner with their continual spatial circulation of individuals, families, and villages. Incompleteness in persons, institutions, cultures, civilizations, being human, and in jujus, must be taken not as an apology, not as something that one should be guilty of, but to say that it is the way of the world, a universal. We are all incomplete, as I have tried to stress in this series of lectures, and no incompleteness is exactly the same as another. But each incompleteness offers an opportunity for interesting encounters and creative outcomes. Such mutual enhancement is evident in the adventures and interactions that between the earthly person in the bush of ghosts, who, like an anthropologist, turns native to the point of staying in his field site for 24 years without coming back home. Many anthropologists can only dream about that, staying there for 24 years. This earthly was in the bush of ghosts for 24 years. This idea of mutually enhancing one another is a useful building block for the conviviality that we should aspire to build from the humility and courage of incompleteness and the mobilities it occasions. It is an exercise informed by life as a process of being and letting be through relationships of debt and indebtedness. To have an approach to citizenship that is informed by incompleteness is to disabuse ourselves of any pretensions to fullness, purity, or superiority, and to point to the violence and violations that delusions around the idea of completeness have caused the world. Ambitions of completeness keep everyone anxious and conflictual, whereas incompleteness is very reassuring. It encourages one to not necessarily be attracted and to seek to reproduce those who are like us, but to be able to get used to the people who are not like us. It makes civilizations move to embrace one another without the ambitions of taking over, but just understanding, getting enriched, and learning to live together. It is about embracing what is without being confined by it. To speak citizenship and belonging in whatever form is to imagine and construct a living togetherness that takes seriously the reality of interconnections and interdependencies. One is and becomes a citizen through relationships with others, relationships that are institutionalized in one form or another. Institutionalization in terms of custom, law, and practice is where the trouble lies, especially in contexts glued to the elusive pursuit of completeness in a bounded existence, as it's often politically predetermined, policed, and structural, thereby inhibiting the fluidity to be renegotiated. But it is important to be constantly mindful of the fact that human institutions are subject to renegotiation with experiences and in recognition of the permanence of incompleteness. There is power in incompleteness as a prism, through which to perceive life and live our creative ingenuity. Conviviality as a disposition that makes accommodating and being accommodated possible arises from and is constantly enriched by a consciousness and alertness to the reality and the universality of incompleteness, and the need for flexible mobilities and encounters and interactions with incomplete others that are generative of mutual activation and potency for efficacious action and interaction. Let us individually and collectively be ready to open up and accommodate those we may have left behind, consciously or inadvertently. Let us appreciate the enriching potentialities of new encounters made possible by the reality of our dynamism as people and the dynamism on the dynamic world in which we seek to live and hopefully let live. Thank you very much. Thank you.